Good evening, everybody. It is Adrian's Weather Forecast back with another video. And in this video, we're going to be doing an overall analysis on major Category 4 Hurricane Lee, which did reach Category 5 status last night. In this video, we're going to be looking at the overall future forecast on whether it could regain strength and rapidly intensify again, as well looking at the time frame, the cone, the potential track, and whether we could see possible effects for the East Coast and Canada. So, as many as you know, Hurricane Lee did become a Category 5 hurricane yesterday, and as well, Recon not only found very strong winds, I believe it was 145 knots, or it could have been 150 knots uh, in flight level. I believe it was 145. Actually, I believe it was 150 knots. I could be wrong at flight level, and it also did find 925 millibars, and that's extremely low pressure. This storm it still is, but was an absolute monster for the past 36 hours. It increased 80 miles an hour in 24 hours. That is basically unheard of. So here's what we have right now as of the latest National Hurricane Center update. It is sitting at 150 miles an hour. And as well, in yesterday's forecast last night, it was actually forecast at a peak of 180 miles an hour. That is absolutely insane and almost unheard of. I believe Allen was 190, which is the strongest storm in the North Atlantic in history. So that's just 10 miles off. And the fact that this is sitting at around 50 around 57, or actually closer to 55 degrees west, that is extremely rare for a storm to strengthen to that strength that so far southeast. It hasn't even crossed the Caribbean yet. So 942 millibars is the current pressure. So obviously it is starting to weaken as it has experienced unforecasted shear, which is to the north, and that is a reason why for its weakening overall. However, it is likely as it continues to move on west northwesterly into more favorable conditions regarding shear. Again, the warm waters aren't even a problem, but this is what we have so far. And then we have again the tropical storm Margaret right behind it, but we're obviously more focused on Hurricane Lee. So here's the overall look on the IR here for Hurricane Lee. So it is looking a lot worse than what it did look like last night. Again, last night it had a really strong CDO, a very clear eye wall. I mean, your typical Category 5 hurricane. However, we are, as again, like I said, it is experiencing shear to the north. We are starting to see kind of this core start to fall apart here. And as well, what we're seeing is kind of this, the eye basically is disappearing here. So we went from like a really large, almost Dorian type eye to it's become a very extreme and thin pinhole. And this is obviously not the Western Pacific, so a pinhole necessarily isn't good in this scenario, as it is showing that this core overall in the storm here is starting to fall apart due to that shear and those unexpected conditions. And you can kind of see here that we are seeing a southerly wind movement, while again the surface we do have easterlies, where there's or easterlies, more than likely easterlies, as the storm again is moving west northwesterly, almost westerly, and we are seeing kind of these storms and convection getting pushed north. So we are kind of seeing again that shear problem become an issue when you look at the overall vector. So that is a reason why the storm is starting to fall apart here. But overall, again, it is still 150 miles an hour, a very unsymmetrical, uh, very unsymmetrical storm here. And like I said, we still have a lot of convections, we still have a lot of hot towers, but overall the core has weakened generally a lot. And if we look at the overall, if we look at visible, you're going to see the same thing here, where kind of the storm starts to cave in into each other. So all the convections kind of bunching up in the center. So we're not having that very clear eye wall with, again, the calm in the storm. We're not really having that. We're kind of just seeing all this convection kind of really kind of just blow up in the middle here. So we're not having kind of a clear access or a clear core necessarily, which you'd again expect for 150 miles an hour. So the storm is expected to weaken a little bit, but again, as it goes into better conditions with the next day or now, it's more than likely gonna again become more than likely a probably strong 150-mile-an-hour hurricane still, and it may even possibly even regain strength back into a Category 5. Definitely not out of the question, but very beautiful structure here. You can kind of see kind of that outflow with the upper layer anticyclone or ULAC. So we are kind of still seeing somewhat that overall protection from shear with the ULAC, but again, really nice outflow with this storm. Then you see the very strong inflow kind of pouring in, but again, that's where we're also seeing that shear issue where it's kind of making the core not necessarily perfectly upright. It is kind of tilting that core, which is why the storm is kind of caving in the way it is. But again, it is still a more than likely healthy storm, a lot less healthy than it was earlier. But again, it's not really expected to weaken that much. It should stay stable for the next day or so. But once it pushes out further west northwesterly, it has a lot more favorable conditions. So here is the latest cone from the National Hurricane Center on the latest advisory. So pretty large, pretty large wind field, and it looks symmetrical from here, but this is a little bit on the older side. Again, this did update more than a few hours ago. So, however, again, as this overall axis of the core in general is tilting, we're going to be seeing kind of an unsymmetric wind field and overall unsymmetric convection, which we're kind of seeing favor more towards the east of the storm. But again, expected to continue to stay as a major hurricane. There is no question. It's gonna, even if it does weaken, it's more than likely it's gonna weaken to a moderate Category 4 hurricane. But more than likely, it's expected to stay around 140 miles an hour. And the question is, where could this possibly? It is going to go out to sea, and we may have a threat later on this weekend, or not weekend, but later on next week, for possibly Canada or even New England to experience these effects. But right now, we're more than focused on when is this storm going to curve kind of toward the northeast, because it is going to curve to the northeast, and I'll show you guys why in a little bit. But the question is, when will it curve northeast? Because we kind of have a trough and as well a ridge that kind of really playing toss up, and it kind of just depends which one's stronger, or which one's further, or which one's closer to the storm, and that's going to really be a big factor in when this storm does turn northeast, and that's going to be very significant. It may not make landfall in the United States, or at least in the southeast, but depending how close it is, it's obviously going to have effects with obviously waves. Obviously, we are going to still be seeing very nasty waters, because this is again a major hurricane. We're going to continue to see these effects. Even Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and Haiti and Hispaniola, we are going to be seeing these effects, regardless if it's not making landfall or not. But and you can kind of see the cones starting to push up towards the north. So the National Hurricane Center is thinking it's going to start making that shift pretty far away from the Bahamas, but again, still more than likely to be seeing very nasty water conditions. And as well, again, we're still worried about any shipping boats that are going to be within this area, because those waters are going to be very dangerous, because again, it is going to be about 140 miles an hour of just water getting basically thrown all over the place here. So again, that's what we have there. But if we look at the overall, I do want to look at the key messages. I haven't even read this yet. But again, we are going to be seeing dangerous surf and life-threatening rip currents across the northern Leeward Islands, as well into Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Turks and Caicos, and the Bahamas, and even Bermuda. Bermuda is going to be very close. I mean, it's not going to be very close, but they are going to be the closest, more than likely, to the landfall than any other areas other than possibly Canada. Um, Again, there may be effects on the East Coast, Atlantic Canada, Bermuda late next week, especially as the storm does slow down, as it's going to be slowing down with the contradiction between the ridge and the trough, which will slow down as it does start to make that maneuver. But again, either way, we are going to be seeing dangerous surf and rip currents all on the East Coast, and maybe even a little slight change in gusts and winds, not necessarily from the hurricane, but as the trough does move in, we are going to be seeing systems that will be bringing rain and overall cooler weather along the East Coast. But again, not worried about a direct U.S. landfall. We will have to wait till later next week to see if there's any threats with Canada, which again could more than likely be likely. But overall, we're still going to be monitoring this again, although it's not going to make landfall, at least in the southeast and mid Atlantic. Still, I will stay away from the waters, especially with those dangerous strip currents and turfs or and surfs, because again, this is going to be a major hurricane just a few hundred miles off the coast. I do want to show you guys the overall IR here as well. This is just come out just a few hours ago, and it kind of does show you how kind of unsymmetrical this category 4 hurricane is. So if you kind of just draw kind of where that overall low pressure is. Oh my god, I cannot draw it evenly. There we go. Kind of draw where that center, where typically this would be the center of the hurricane. You can kind of see a lot of the banding and a lot of that really significant convection and precipitation and overall storms are firing off mainly on the east side. So we are going to be kind of seeing with the inflow, we are going to be seeing kind of that threat with shear kind of messing up and tilting that storm. And in this case, it's tilting the storm more towards the east here. That's where you kind of have that very strong CDO maintaining with moisture. But again, you can kind of see there is that core. This did come out a few hours ago, so it's more than likely to be a lot messier now. But this still does give you an overall idea on the overall kind of unsymmetrical structure that we have here. But still, again, very good banding of convection. Again, remember, this is still 150 miles an hour, so it's not like falling apart necessarily. But it is definitely not the best structure for a Category 4 hurricane, especially with how mature it was just a day ago. But again, we're going to be watching out the possibility for an IWAL replacement cycle. If you do look here, within maybe the next day or so or less than that, we could possibly see maybe a second IWAL start to develop with those bandings. And again, if that does occur, we will more than likely expect intensification, possibly at least slight intensification later this weekend if we do get an IWAL replacement cycle pretty soon, because you kind of do see two areas of thick convection. But we will have to monitor this for the next few hours to see whether it does out overpower that current IWAL. But again, very good structure, which again unsymmetrical but still pretty mature structure. And then we're gonna be looking at here is another basic. We're gonna be looking at basically the microwave this or the brightness temperature. And again, very similar to what we just looked at. Again, this came at the same time as the last one, so there's that unsymmetrical structure. And again, we are seeing kind of those hot towers obviously remaining on the eastern side of the storm here. But overall, still pretty healthy structure, a lot less healthy and compact and overall organized than yesterday. But yesterday it was extremely strong to the point where the National Hurricane Center predicted an 180-mile-an-hour peak, which is absolutely crazy. I don't think I've ever seen a peak like that ever, to be honest. But again, we do have possibility for an IWAL replacement cycle, which again will be a second IWAL replacing the current IWAL. But we shouldn't be we shouldn't be expecting that anytime soon necessarily. But within maybe the next 18 hours or so, we could expect that, and that could explain the kind of over convection in the center of the storm, kind of just blowing up storms, and it's going to be a very messy mode right now. But again, if we do get an IWAL replacement cycle within the next day or so or less, we could see kind of a mature and core, especially as it does move into areas of lesser shear, which again, a lot of that shear is kind of more towards the north right now. We do kind of move further into areas of maybe like 20 knots or so. Even 30 knots, it shouldn't be that affected if we have such a strong system like this with high protection of outflow. Then definitely could see reorganization, especially as it does towards northward. And again, intensification will also alter when it does make that movement to the north. So now that we kind of looked at what it looks like right now and all that, let's look at the future. And what this is going to include is going to be an explanation for why it's going to be turning the way it is and what factors are going to be contributing into why it is going to be doing what it is. So right now, this is basically the latest 18Z, which is basically just finished completely updating. So we do have a trough that's going to be moving in here in the southeast. We are going to be seeing a trough. This isn't the main trough we're focused on, but we do have a high pressure. We do have a ridge here right to the north of the storm. And as we continue to move on, it's going to continue to west-northwesterly movement. And what you would expect is that with such a strong at the 500 millibars, which is a strong ridge just to the north. You would expect this storm were to, what typically would happen is maintain going westerly. So you would think we're gonna have a threat with Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, Cuba, Bahamas, Florida, all that, all that. But that's not gonna be the case because there's that trough right here. We're gonna be seeing a pretty strong trough, and then we're gonna be seeing a very strong, or not very strong, but we're gonna be seeing a pretty large expansive ridge. So the reason why the storm isn't gonna be necessarily a threat for the southeast or Gulf of Mexico or anywhere in this general vicinity is because that trough is pretty strong and it is going to be practically close to the coast at this point. So it's going to force this storm will continue to go westward because it's still pretty far from that trough and closer to that ridge. So it will continue to go westward. Like I said, like this ridge is pretty expansive. You can kind of see there's that high pressure, but there's that trough continuing near the coast there. So let's just have our low pressure. It's not down here, but just so you guys can visualize it. And there's that high pressure. So again, as that trough kind of kicks in, this storm will slowly start to maneuver from west to kind of west northwesterly, and you can kind of see it's following kind of that pen there, and there's a high pressure, and then we kind of see that overall you can see the isobars. There's that trough right there, and this storm will continue to, like I said, will continue to strengthen as it does go into more favorable conditions. You can kind of see as well. Typically, what happens as storms kind of start to shift their way north and kind of follow the Gulf Stream, the wind field will become larger. But there it is. There it starts to do that north turn because there's that ridge right there. The ridge is now kind of not to the north anymore, but it is to the east. So it's going to be a lot easier for this storm to now maneuver to the north. And not only that, it's because it's very strong trough at 500 millibars, which is going to kind of, at this point, kind of force that storm to go not along the coast, but a few hundred miles off the coast. And that's going to be the reason why the storm physically cannot make landfall anywhere here. That is the reason. And again, this ridge is very favorable, would be very favorable in a typical scenario to push this towards Florida and the Bahamas at least. But because that trough is there, it is going to kind of get squeezed between the low or between the high pressure and that ridge and that upper level low up here. And it's going to basically act as a basically a field or a force field basically for the East Coast and keep it away from the Mid-Atlantic Northeast. But however, again, later next week, and we possibly could see a threat to, again, you can kind of see how massive that Vort Max gets and the wind field's going to get, because that's what happens when the storm kind of right along that Gulf Stream. It will get pretty unsymmetrical, but it's going to have a very large wind field, and that wind field will stretch unsymmetrically, but if it does get pushed to the east or to the west, we could see some significant winds along the East Coast, even if it doesn't make landfall. But again, possible implications for maybe a landfall in Canada. Again, I'm not going to be talking about that right now because that's way ahead of from now, even though it doesn't seem like it. But again, here's a 500 millibar, so you can kind of see there's that ridge right there. There's that trough, or there's that trough right there. So because that trough kind of really, you can kind of see it's really large trough, it's going to force that storm to go north at first, and then starts to make its way northeastward. But yeah, that's kind of the reasoning why it's not going to make the landfall. And here's kind of overall another setup here. So there's that ridge to the north. There is a really large trough in the Midwest, and then it's going to kind of really, there's an upper level low up there. There's a ridge right here to the northeast of Hurricane Lee, and because this trough is pretty significant and pretty strong, and we might even have a short wave along the actual coast itself, the southeast coast. It's going to kind of push that storm towards the north, and again, we are going to see that trough kind of push out a ridge towards kind of South Greenland. So very expansive area where it could possibly make landfall, especially if that ridge is pushed the way it is with that very significant trough. There is a lot of free room for possibly going out to sea and completely missing Canada, maybe hitting Nova Scotia. There's a whole realm of possibilities depending on that overall trough. But hope you guys enjoyed the video. Again, updates on Hurricane Lee I will be making maybe a video out in the next few days once we get closer to whether there could be possibly indications for Canadian landfall or anything like that, or any U.S. effects. But yep, hope you guys enjoy the forecast.